Okay, so I'm going to be talking about making the outdoor environment accessible for disabled cyclists, or completing a virtuous cycle, as I like to think of it. So first of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Wheels for Wellbeing. Wheels for Wellbeing, we're a disabled people's cycling organisation, and we were established in 2007. And there's two aspects to the work that we do. The first is that we provide access to cycling for disabled people in 3 off-road centres that are based in South London. And we have a fleet of more than 200 cycles of every kind of cycle you can and probably can't imagine. And disabled people can come along, try them out in a really disability positive, safe off-road environment with specially trained instructors. For people who then want to adventure a little further, we have lead rides, again using our cycles where people go off into the urban environment and green spaces. And then we also have a hire scheme, so people who want to cycle completely independently and have some space to store a non-standard cycle can take one of our cycles on a medium to long-term loan and then integrate cycling into their daily life. So that's one aspect of the work that we do. The other aspect, which is where my role sits and which is nationwide, is the campaigns and policy thread of the work. And we do a range of different streams in this. We have an active training and consultancy programme. We have a number of publications, including our recent report of our survey of disabled cyclists, and our guide to inclusive cycling that's currently in edition 4, but we're just about in the process of updating it and writing edition 5. And all of that is free to download from our website. So we're really always happy to be giving things away free, encouraging everybody to make cycling as accessible as possible. We also have a number of active campaigns, including Bash the Barriers, Beyond the Bicycle, and also campaigning for the legal recognition of cycles as mobility aids. And we do all of this within an ethos of mobility justice. And mobility justice is really about demanding that resources are targeted towards those who currently have the least access to mobility and transport, rather than constantly providing more options to people who are already the most privileged or the most well served. So we've been really pleased with the outcomes of some of the work. Our Beyond the Bicycle campaign, which is a coalition with other organisations of people who use non-standard cycles, so family cyclists, logistics cyclists. Our Bash the Barriers campaign and our Guide to Inclusive Cycling was really influential in the LTN 120 design guidance for cycle provision across the country. And on the right-hand side of the screen is an image that's taken from the LTN 120 guidance, which is the cycle design vehicle. And that shows you the dimensions of some of the biggest cycles available. So, for example, a side-by-side tandem, a cargo cycle, a wheelchair carrying cycle. And the dimensions provided are intended to ensure that all infrastructure can accommodate all of these cycles. So all infrastructure should enable all of these cycles to pass through. So we're really happy with that, and we are kind of cheerleaders for LTN 120 a lot of the time because we think that solves a lot of problems. So, just to say, you might have noticed already that I'm probably talking about cycling in a different way that you're used to, so I keep saying cycles and not bikes. And the reason for that is, I guess, is a little bit around clarity and also a little bit political as well in terms of cycling inclusivity. So when we say bike or bicycle, the bi comes from two-wheel. So a bicycle is just very much the standard two-wheel bike that people imagine someone to be cycling on. So we talk about standard cycles, which would be a bike or a bicycle, and non-standard cycles, which is everything else. And this might be cycles that disabled people use, so for example, a hand cycle, a recumbent, a side-by-side. It might be something that a parent uses with their children. It might be a cargo cycle. And we refer to these as non-standard cycles. Often they are referred to as things like adapted or adapted bikes or cycles, And we don't tend to use that language because they are things in their own right. They are not a changed version of a bicycle. In the same way, this is not an adaptive chair. This is a wheelchair. It exists in its own right, as do tandems and hand cycles and recumbents. So we talk about standard cycles, non-standard cycles, and for everything, it's just cycles. So that's just to make sense of what I will be saying. And these cycles, all the different ones you can see on the screen, are illustrated throughout the presentation. So that's a little bit on the language, and it hopefully clarifies what I'm talking about. So just a little bit more detail then around disabled cyclists and their cycles. So this data is taken from a survey that we did in 2021. It's not a representative sample. It's a self-selecting sample of disabled people who already cycle. So it's quite a small proportion of disabled people. So it's not representative, but it is also really worth pointing out that there is no national representative data on disabled people and cycling at all. So we have no baseline data. We gather our own data on a sort of biannual basis, and we can see patterns emerging, but there really is a need for better baseline data, particularly when we are thinking about increasing diversity in access to cycling and people taking up. If we don't know the proportions of disabled people cycling already, we don't know if we're improving it for disabled people and other minoritised groups, or if we're just making the people who are already well served do it more often. So it's really important that we do have good baseline data. From our own data, what we find in terms of the types of cycles that people use is that 60% of our respondents use a standard two-wheel bicycle. Now, that is not hugely surprising given the other statistic that's on the screen is that 86.5% own their own cycle. So if you're going to cycle, the cheapest to buy, the easiest to store, the easiest to get maintained is a standard two-wheel bicycle. If you're looking at anything else, it's going to cost you thousands of pounds. So an e-assist hand cycle or tandem or recumbent can cost between £4,000 and £7,000. So there's already a massive cost barrier. So people using standard two-wheel bikes are slightly overrepresented for the reason that most of our respondents own their own cycle. That said, about a quarter rode a tricycle or a recumbent, so that's an upright or recumbent tricycle. Just over 16% used a hand cycle, and that could be a clip-on that is an attachment to a wheelchair or a one-piece hand cycle. 8.5% rode a tandem, and just under 5% used a cargo cycle. In terms of increasing accessibility, another couple of figures that are worth thinking about. So about a third had e-assist, and e-assist on cycling makes it much more accessible for people to go longer distances, particularly if you're pedalling with your hands, but also to navigate more difficult terrain, as well as thinking about things like utility cycling, where you might be carrying luggage or your work equipment or so on. And about a quarter had a folding cycle, and again, really important for storage, both in terms of being able to take that cycle on public transport, but also being able to store it in the home if you live in high density housing. In terms of the level of cycling, just over 3/4 cycled once a week or more, and a third cycled on a daily basis. So for disabled people who have got a cycle and can cycle, it becomes quite a significant part of their daily activity and their mobility. And we often think about cycling, I suppose particularly in an outdoor context, in terms of sort of recreation, exercise. But also, it's really important to note that for many disabled people, a cycle, and in fact very often a standard two-wheel bicycle, is an essential mobility aid. So many people have difficulty walking for any distance at all, even a few metres, but can get on a bicycle and cycle literally for miles. Given e-assist, can cycle a lot more. So it's really important to remember that for some people, that bicycle is their essential piece of mobility equipment. Nearly 2/3 of our respondents reported that they found cycling easier than walking, and less than 10% found walking easier. There's a couple of quotes on the slides from people talking about why a bicycle was important. So one person said, "I have spinal issues and can't walk any real distance, but I can ride on a normal bike without any problem. It gives me my independence." Another person said, "I've had MS for more than 30 years and I wish I'd realised earlier that I could cycle much better than I could walk." So the other thing to remember about these people is, of course, when they're on a bicycle, they become invisible as disabled people because no one correlates a standard bicycle with being disabled. And yet when people enter those no cycling areas, so if you have a park, a green space, an outdoor area, gardens where it's no cycling, those people have lost their mobility. They've suddenly lost their access to that space. So we always really encourage people to say no cycling except when used as a mobility aid. So for people who have no other means of accessing that space, they can still get that. And again, just put that in the context of the recent research from Disabled Ramblers that found that 90% of mobility impaired disabled people don't have a suitable piece of mobility equipment to complete a 1 kilometre journey. So many people are so restricted in terms of what they can access. 1 kilometre, I mean, that's just getting to your bus stop, isn't it? Let alone anything beyond that. So really encourage people to remember that a bicycle and non-standard cycles can be essential mobility for many people, and to permit people to use them in those outdoor spaces. The next slide is another just mostly visual representation of some of the different kinds of cycles that disabled people ride. So there's a side-by-side tricycle, tandem, there's a solo tricycle, there's a back-to-front tandem, and then a tandem that people might not have seen, which is an upright back and a recumbent front for the pilot. There's an adapted Brompton and a hand cycle. So again, just some of the range of cycles that are available. And again, as I've said, we don't have good baseline data on disabled people and cycling, but Sustrans and Arup did some research, and in their sample they found that while 7% of disabled people currently cycled, around 30%, so nearly a third, would like to if the barriers to cycling were removed. So we don't know if that's nationally representative, but what we do know is that disabled people make up 20% of the population. That's 16 million people. So there's potentially 5 million people wanting to cycle. So even on that figure alone, that's a lot of people who would really like to be able to cycle and to access outdoor spaces with their cycles. So let's find out a little bit more about the types of cycling journeys that disabled people who have a cycle or can access cycling currently make. So where the numbers on there are a little small. So just under 89% of our respondents said that they cycled for fun or leisure. 84% said they exercised to stay fit. They cycle for exercise and stay fit, and 63% said they cycled for mental health reasons. People could pick more than one reason, that's why it doesn't add up to 100%. And then between work commutes and general transport journeys, that made up 87%. So again, we have a very high proportion of people cycling as a leisure activity and for essential physical and mental health. Some of that, again, is reflected in the fact that some people can only access cycling as a leisure activity because they're using cycles at cycle sessions. But across this, one of the things, so whether people are cycling for commuting or for leisure, the mental and physical health impacts are something that disabled people really emphasise very strongly. And again, this is in the context where access to exercise, to outdoors, to nature is really limited for disabled people because there are so many barriers to accessing those things. So in terms of the physical and mental health impacts, one of our respondents said, being a disabled person who can get out and cycle has been a lifesaver for me. When cycling, I feel less disabled. It's the best treatment for my mental health. Another person said, I find it hugely enabling to cycle around for transport and my commute. It keeps me active and mobile and prevents degenerative decline in my muscles, and it makes me feel good about myself. So again, it's that exercise, it's being outdoors, but for many disabled people, it's also one of the few autonomous and independent forms of mobility that they have that really doesn't involve anybody else having to do ramps or offer assistance or move dogs around or anything else. It's like, this is where you can be autonomous. And of course, you have access to nature and green spaces. The little picture on the corner, that is me. That was a holding picture till I got some photos from a nature ride that one of our lead rides went on. Anyway, I didn't get the picture, so you've still got me. That's the Great Orme in Llandudno with a rainbow over it, which appeared after I'd hand cycled around the Great Orme. So I felt that that rainbow was very much a positive encouragement for other disabled cyclists to go around the Great Orme. So, we know that cycling offers all these benefits in terms of mobility, physical and mental health, autonomy. So why don't more disabled people cycle? So year on year we see the same patterns and themes of the main barriers to cycling being repeated. So first and foremost is infrastructure, that always comes out top, and that's in terms of inaccessible cycle paths, be they on or off-road, the barriers that prevent access, the quality of those paths. Parking and storage is another significant barrier. So if you've spent a lot of money on a non-standard cycle and then there's nowhere to store it safely at your home or your destination, you're not going to bother taking it out or spending thousands of pounds on one in the first place. The cost is another significant barrier, and again, the cost of cycles themselves, but also in the context of the disability pay and employment gap, and we know that disabled people are more likely to live in poverty than other households in the UK. People also talk about the lack of opportunity to hire or try out cycles at an inclusive cycling centre. And there's also the level of public hostility or abuse that disabled people face, particularly if you're doing something that the population don't seem to think is appropriate for a disabled person. So I'm just going to talk through some of those in a little bit more detail. I think we've probably already covered quite a bit of the infrastructure barriers. So you can see three classics on the screen. There is the A-frame, the York barriers, and a kissing gate with a weird cage around it. So all of these prevent access to any off-road green spaces, cycle tracks, for anyone on a non-standard cycle, so disabled cyclists, but also people who are using a family cycle or a cargo cycle. But they don't stop antisocial behaviour. So if you look on YouTube, you can see someone get a scrambler bike through an A-frame in about 3 seconds. So what we have is something that prevents legitimate users from accessing those spaces, but doesn't stop the antisocial behaviour that they are designed to prevent. And then what they do is they very often force people back into the road or the less safe or less pleasant cycling environments. So as one of our participants said, barriers on cycle routes are sometimes extremely difficult for tandems to pass. The rear handlebars have to be turned or the whole bike lifted to fit around closely spaced barriers. Having been forced onto a road, we got shouted at for being too long when he was passing on a suburban road. So these do cause significant risk for people using non-standard cycles, and they do discriminate against disabled people. These barriers are not Equality Act compliant. They should be being removed, and they should certainly never be being installed. So it's one thing to use the Equality Act to try and remove existing barriers, but it is absolutely not Equality Act compliant to put new ones in. any barrier that goes in needs a minimum of 1.5 metre spacing in order to meet accessibility standards. And again, you know, LTM 120 is very clear that these kinds of barriers should not be used at all. So please, if you see proposals for these kind of barriers to go in, remind people that they are not Equality Act compliant and they are discriminating against legitimate users of green spaces. The next, and again, I think we're all probably fairly familiar with some of these, is a couple of pictures of thinking about the quality and sizing of surfacing. So when we're thinking about paths, we need paths with a certain surface quality, width, a minimal camber, and certain gradient levels are considered accessible. Again, the detail, the techie detail of that is in LTM 120. So when we're thinking about seeing a pathway as accessible, it's really important to think about these features and remember that things like uneven surfaces, such as potholes, can be really dangerous if you're riding on 3 wheels. It might be something that 2 wheels can skirt around or balance over. With 3, it can become very unstable. And also, if you have a pain condition, it's kind of really unpleasant and unnavigable. So access feature. And then also thinking about the overgrowth, and again particularly thinking about the height of overgrowth. Is that going to cause injury to a blind or visually impaired person, be they walking or cycling a tandem? So again, very often people talk about designated cycle paths, but the maintenance or the quality of them makes them unusable. So, as one of our participants said, the roads and cycleways are too badly maintained, even in major cities, for me to safely cycle, as my 3-wheel clip-on is vulnerable to tip-in potholes. Again, I live and cycle in Liverpool and can testify to the pain of poor quality cycle and road surfaces. So again, thinking about those cycleways having really good quality is important. In terms of arriving at a destination, parking and storage for non-standard cycles is a really key issue. So on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a couple of images of cycle parking that is being rolled out. So one of them is the 2-tier cycle parking, which is based on someone being able to pick up a bike, lift it in an overhead rack, and store it. So obviously that doesn't work for disabled cyclists. It doesn't actually work for a lot of e-bikes because they're really heavy. It doesn't actually work for a lot of women either because they're designed at the height of the average man, so they're not particularly usable for a very large proportion of the population. And there's no room to store non-standard cycles. So it's not to say don't have any of them, but it's about having provision for other cycles as well as people who can just happily pick up a bicycle and put it in one of those. Again, things like security cages that require you to up and end a bicycle to store it, or lockers that you see. Again, that's ruling out very many cyclists and of bicycles, of non-standard cycles, and again thinking about e-bikes, which are much heavier and more difficult to manoeuvre. A couple of other images on the screen are attempts that people have made to have designated cycle parking for disabled cyclists. Neither of these are perfect, so I wouldn't recommend you try and sort of photograph that and 3D print it out and think it's solved. Like, cycle parking is actually quite complex. But these are 2 efforts, and I think what is interesting about them is the space around them. The fact that you can cycle in and out, because non-standard cycles don't reverse, and you can't just again stand up and pull it out, and that it's very clearly designated and they're close to the destination point. So there are some simple things you can think about to make cycle parking more accessible for people using non-standard cycles. And saying that, I would always designate non-standard cycles and specifically disabled cyclists, remembering that some disabled cyclists ride a bicycle and need to be very close to their access points for the destination because they can't walk far or practically at all. If you're interested, we do run a whole training on cycle parking. You'd be amazed the joys of cycle parking detail that you can go into. So that's something about parking and storage for people who have their own cycles. For people who don't, it's thinking about hire and share schemes. So again, we asked our participants if they'd ever hired or a cycle or used a share scheme. The majority hadn't, because already, as we know, the majority of our participants own their own cycle. But for those that didn't, it was because the kind of cycle that they needed or specific adaptations to a particular cycle were not available on a hire or share scheme. So bike shares usually literally are bike shares, and therefore again exclude people who could really do with access to affordable cycling where you don't have to think about storing and maintaining a cycle yourself. So again, a couple of our participants said, I didn't know I could hire a cycle, but even so, I'm not sure the kind of bicycle I need will be available for hire, as I have specific needs and I can't use an ordinary bicycle. Another person said, I would like to hire a good upright touring tricycle when on holiday, but I've never found any tricycle hire. So there is a need for the availability of shared use. But I would also caution, it's not just as simple as going out and spending 80 grand on a lovely fleet of non-standard cycles, parking them by the bikes and then wondering why no disabled people are using them. So few disabled people have had the opportunity to cycle ever or to try out different cycles. It's very unlikely that you are, at least initially in the next few years, going to get that kind of just roll-up use. So if you're thinking about hire and share schemes, it's thinking about partnering with a local inclusive cycling centre. At last count, there was nearly 200 around the country, so you are very likely to find one in your area, so that people can go and try out different cycles and then figure out what is going to work for them, what they feel safe on, what is pain-free for them to ride, and then think about that being incorporated into a hire scheme where you can pick up a cycle and go up a nice route or around a lake or wherever you're going for the day. So it does require a little bit more thought and specialisation than just, like I say, spending lots of money on cycles and just leaving there. So really recommend partnership working if you're thinking about hire schemes. And then lastly, in terms of barriers to cycling, it's both the attitudinal barriers or, I guess, discrimination at both the policy and the social level. So at one point there, at the policy level, there are very few disabled people working in fields of outdoor activity, active travel, and so on. So there tends to be a constant, to use the cycling word, recycling of perceptions that disabled people can't or don't cycle or aren't interested. And then we have schemes designed which are designed just for your regular bicyclist, and then sort of occasional attempts to adapt them to fit disabled cyclists, but they don't actually work because they're not based on that sort of deeper knowledge about disabled people's experience and what will make cycling accessible. So one person said, as with everything else in my life, my cycling is controlled by people who don't have a disability. Until such times as people with disabilities gain positions of power to influence infrastructure, financial support, etc., this will never change. So again, there's that need for change at the policy and decision-making level. But there's also a need for wider social change. I think we don't talk often about the levels of harassment and hate crime towards disabled people and the level of hostility. I don't know if anybody saw last week, the Telegraph had a calculator where you could put in your wages and it will calculate how much disabled people were costing you. And this is one of our mainstream newspapers. So we live in a climate where there is a lot of hostility to disabled people, and that gets played out then in the public realm. So again, this is something that is quite commonly reported to us. So one person said, the public's response to my non-standard cycle is appalling, and that is things like being stared at, shouted at, laughed at, commented on. And then this got worse during the pandemic for many people. And again, we find that social hostility towards minoritised groups tends to increase at times of public crisis. So of course we saw huge rises during the pandemic. So one person said, "I've been shocked at the aggression of the public towards me using a hand cycle during lockdown. I've been met with several confrontations about disabled people being clinically extremely vulnerable, as if we shouldn't be outside." So again, there is this constant sense of people policing what they think disabled people should and shouldn't be doing. And Sustrans, in their research last year, they found that only 56% of disabled people felt safe and welcome in their local community. So imagine going beyond that into another space that is not familiar and is not your local community. The sense of safety and welcomeness most likely often decreases. So what can we do to address some of this? So some of it is about really normalising disabled people as an inevitable part of human diversity, doing all kinds of things, and having positive depictions. So when we're designing policy, information leaflets, it's representing disabled people in all aspects of that, and not just as service users, but also as people who are working in those environments, who are service providers. So then when people are out and about and see disabled people doing those things, it's no longer remarkable or noticeable that there's a blind person or a deaf person or a wheelchair user in this role. That is something to be expected. And we are currently at Wales Wellbeing developing a photograph library. So we're developing an image resource which will be freely available, free to download, of disabled people cycling, so that people do have access to that resource. So you've got something that you can put into your brochures, your policy, your information and so on. So hopefully we will launch that later this year. So I'm just about on time. So to finish off, I think it's about, not everything is going to be fully accessible, ever, probably. I mean, there's some things, especially outdoors, that you can't make accessible without cutting the tops off mountains and concreting them over. And nobody is advocating that. So it's thinking really about the things surrounding it and having really accurate information and not being afraid to give out that information. So I know personally often when I ring up for access information, people seem really awkward or embarrassed about telling me it's not accessible and sort of give me a fake, just tell me. If the steps, just tell me and I won't waste my time. Go in there, I'll find someone else. So please be very clear about that information, and obviously that's something that Craig and Experienced Community are working on, again, sort of visual photograph information about accessibility so people can make an informed decision about whether they want to go there and whether it's worth trying. And again, it's information about the whole range of facilities that are there. So parking, but not just for cars, for cycles, for mobility aids, for prams and buggies. Think about all the things that people might need to leave somewhere for a while. About the accessibility of public transport to get there, the accessibility of toilets, is there a changing places, are the refreshment points accessible, are rest areas accessible? Are there accessible points of interest? So can you actually see the things that you're going to see, or is there a wall at this height that, there was not much point in me hand cycling 5 miles to get to? Are the routes barrier-free? And again, it's really important to have that accurate mapping, because one barrier can waste a whole journey. So know about those barriers that are there. Information about the route, so the type of path it is, the gradient, the surface, and so on. And also, please put your access information in accessible formats on your website. It's no good having access information if people can't actually access it. So please do think about that. And again, it's get expert help to make websites accessible. There are all sorts of specialists that can provide that service. And the last thing I'd say is please also remember that disabled people don't always go round with non-disabled people. Often we spend our social time with other disabled people, and very many disabled women are also carers for children and non-disabled people. So when accessible facilities are designed on the basis that you have a disabled person on their own with a non-disabled person, it prevents many people from accessing that space or being able to use it. So remember, people with different impairments are often trapped together, and there are often families with more than one disabled person who would like to be there. To finish, always remember the Equality Act, please, and particularly the public sector equality duty for people working with local authorities, which not only means you can't discriminate, you actually have to actively promote the equality of people with protected characteristics, including disabled people. Lots of techie cycling stuff in LTM 120. There is our guide to inclusive cycling, updated version due out at the end of summer. There's a couple of DFT publications, including Inclusive Mobility and the updated Manual for Streets, which is supposed to be out later this year, which also have, again, quite techy, useful guidance if you're looking for that kind of detail. Transport for All have a pavement pledge, again, if you're looking to think about making those sort of pedestrian environments really accessible for everybody. And for anything else you might like to know, please do get in touch with us. Like I say, we do loads of training and consultancy. We're really happy to work with other organisations on specific projects or more generally, and always really happy to hear from people who want to make cycling accessible. References, you'll get these slides later if you want to follow any of them up, and contact details if you want to be in touch.